pistol, while the women gathered wild corn and oranges. They roasted the turkey over an open fire on the driveway that led up to the farmhouse. The oranges were small and full of seeds, and almost as tart as a lemon. But they were very good, and very juicy. They ate until they were bloated and tired. Then they crawled up here to this hayloft to sleep. But it was the smoke from the fire that had given them away. That's where they had screwed up, he realized. The evening had been a clear one, and the white column of smoke from their campfire must have been visible for miles. They might as well have put up a neon sign. Stupid, he thought. He knew better. We've got bigger problems than that, Richardson said. Look over there. He nodded toward the road. The red man's caravan of trucks was parked there, and a few of his soldiers were offloading the zombies.
What are they doing?
Avery asked. The answer seemed obvious to Richardson. If the red man could control zombies, he'd obviously use them to fill the front lines of an attack on McHenry's squad. He was more worried about how they were going to escape. Richardson crawled over to the far side of the hayloft and peered out of the west side of the barn. The cornfield stretched into the distance some 400 or 500 yards, terminating in a line of trees, the edge of which was thick with early morning fog. He saw the zombies right away, 40 or 50 of them at least, stumbling their way through the rows. Damn, he muttered.
What is it?
Sylvia asked. No go, he said. They've got us surrounded. He moved back to his previous position next to Sylvia and squeezed the hay and dust from his eyes.
You okay?
Sylvia asked. Allergies, he said.
Yeah, well, do us all a favor and don't sneeze, okay?
He gave her a half-hearted smile, and then went back to watching the battle develop down below. Roving camera, he thought. Don't get involved. The mantra that had carried him through so many dangerous situations over the last few years seemed ridiculous now. He was in this up to his eyeballs. He leaned forward through shafts of sunlight and put his face up against one of the gaps in the barn's wall. They were in a unique position to see the battle develop, like a high school marching band director up on a ladder stand. A group of black shirts ran forward, firing their guns into the weeds, sending up a spray of exploded corn in the process. McHenry's squad just hunkered down on their bellies, letting the shots tear up the corn over their heads. They didn't return fire until the black shirts broke through the corn rows right in front of them, and then they started shooting back. It was, Richardson saw, a deliberate feint on the part of the black shirts. As soon as McHenry's squad started shooting, the black shirts fell back. One of them popped a canister of orange smoke and threw it at McHenry's location. Immediately a column of smoke rose into the air. A moan went up from the west side of the barn, and the zombies moved forward, converging on the smoke. Beside him, Avery groaned.
They'll be slaughtered,
she said. Richardson was thinking the same thing. This wasn't going to be pretty. There were even more zombies in the corn than Richardson had at first thought. They were everywhere. The corn rows were writhing. McHenry's men had already spotted the first few zombies coming at them, and were forming themselves into a defensive circle. The men were keeping their cool, firing in controlled bursts at the zombies as they appeared, perhaps because they didn't know exactly how outnumbered they were. But from his position in the hayloft, Richardson could see that the end was a foregone conclusion. It was just a matter of time. "Where did all those zombies come from?" Richardson asked. "There's way more down there than what he brought in those trucks of his."
"He collects them as he goes," Sylvia said. "That's why he's so strong. No matter where he goes, his army comes to him."
Her voice seemed strangely flat, and Richardson turned to look at her. Sunshine was slanting down into the shadows of the loft through the gaps in the slats. Dust and bits of hay floated around her hair. Her beauty surprised him for the second time, and it was all the more striking for the somber expression on her face. From the cornfield down below, a man let out a sudden, terrible scream, and Sylvia flinched. And in that moment, the tone of her voice and the sadness in her eyes made sense to him. "You know those men down there, don't you?" She nodded. Then she closed her eyes and ducked her chin to her chest as she tried to shut out the noise of the screams and the constant roll of the gunfire. "I'm sorry," he said.
They came here because of us.
She rubbed her knuckles into her forehead, as though trying to scrub away a mounting headache.
Why do so many people have to die because of what I believe, Ben?
Her question was spoken so faintly he had trouble hearing it. He started to tell her it was going to be okay, that what was going on down there was not her fault, but the end result of a course of action those men had chosen themselves. But then he realized that she wasn't talking about those men down there. He had driven the bus out of San Antonio 8 years ago, when she lost all the students that came with her as part of the People for an Ethical Solution expedition, and he had stolen a few glances at her as they trundled through the ruins. She hadn't spoken a word, and that had bothered Richardson at the time. It had more than bothered him. He'd been offended to the core by what he perceived as her icy indifference to the deaths she had just caused. 40 college kids were dead because they had placed blind faith in her. Richardson knew she hadn't planned on their dying. If anything, their deaths would be a mortal blow to her cause. So no, he didn't believe she had intentionally caused their deaths. But she had used her position as a professor, as an intellectual authority in their lives, to lead them into the meat grinder. And wasn't that just as bad? At the time, he thought so. And a part of him hated her because she sat there on that bus, refusing to utter a word. She simply sat there, her chin in her hand, watching the ruins of San Antonio slip away outside the bus. At the quarantine wall, they'd been stopped by the military. Soldiers had led them off the bus and checked their papers and stripped them and checked them for injuries, and then sprayed them down with antivirals and disinfectant. Right before they were separated, he had asked her, "What are you going to tell them?" She wouldn't look at him even then.
Tell them whatever you want, she said. I don't care what you say.
And then the soldiers led her away for her debriefing, and he watched her go, feeling angry and, for some reason that he couldn't quite fathom, betrayed. He had no idea what he had expected her to say, but it hadn't been that. Sylvia turned from the slats in the wall and looked at him. She looked ill, and it occurred to him that he had forced the old wound open by coming back into her life like this. Good, he thought, surprised at how fresh the anger still seemed. I hope it hurts, she said. I told myself I would go to the parents of each of those kids on that bus, Ben. That was the promise I made myself. I figured those kids deserved it for believing the way they did. I knew none of those parents would understand, but I told myself I would do it anyway. But you never went, he said. He intended the words to have more heat than they did. She was tearing herself up inside, he realized. She was doing more damage to herself with her memories than he ever could do with his harsh words. No, she said. I never went. I had all their names, all their addresses. The university fired me, of course, so I had nothing but time. But then the weeks slipped by, and I hadn't visited a single one. All I did was stay in bed and cry. I told myself I'd at least write a letter, but— She trailed off there, shaking her head at the memory of her failure. A bullet struck the slats down at the other end of the loft, and a laser of light lanced into the darkness. The yelling was getting louder now, the fight spilling into the driveway in front of the farmhouse. Just a quick glance was enough for Richardson to see that McHenry's squad had completely broken ranks. They were fighting hand to hand now, totally unorganized. Sylvia, he said, you two come over here with me. We need to stay— There was a crack, and something sliced the air in front of his face. He felt a tingling spread across his cheek that suddenly turned into a burn. His first thought was, "I've been shot." And then, as shock gave way to denial, he touched his fingers to his face and felt small bits of wood splinters stuck in his skin. "Only splinters," he thought. "Oh, thank God." He turned to the wood slats and saw the jagged hole left by the bullet that had narrowly missed his head. Looking through it, he could see one of the last of McHenry's squad down there on the road, swinging his rifle like a club at a zombie. The zombie went down, but there were more pouring out of the corn every second. Richardson heard men yelling orders off to his right, and turned to see several of the Red Man's soldiers running toward the farmhouse. One of the black shirts raised his rifle as he ran, and fired at the last of McHenry's squad. The man who had been using his rifle as a club was struck in the chest and was flung backward, with bloody bits of flesh and fabric spraying up from the wound. One of the zombies behind him twisted suddenly and stumbled to his knees. The zombie's hands were swatting at the air like he was being attacked by bees, bright gouts of blood oozing down his chest from the wound where his face had been. When the zombie fell over dead, Richardson turned back to Sylvia. She and Avery were still holding each other. "Get down," he hissed. "Both of you get down." Avery looked at him from beneath Sylvia's mass of hair. Her eyes were shining with tears. He motioned to her to lie down in the hay, and after a moment, she and Sylvia both lowered themselves down on their bellies. A pair of trucks pulled up to the driveway below them, and Richardson crawled back to the wall and looked through the bullet hole. The Red Man was standing next to one of the trucks, surveying the destruction. There were bodies all around him. Most were zombies, but here and there Richardson could see a few of McHenry's squad, and even one or two of the black shirts. He could also see a lot of wounded zombies, some of them so badly shot up they couldn't even crawl, while others, dragging dead legs or waving armless stumps, staggered toward the trucks. The Red Man let out a low, rattling moan, and all the zombies stopped. None of them blinked. They just stared at him, swaying on their feet as though drunk. Then he motioned toward the truck, and two of his soldiers pulled Nicky Booth from the cab. "Oh, my God," Avery said. "Nicky!" "Shh," Richardson cautioned her. "Not too loud." The Red Man held out a hand, and one of his soldiers handed him a knife. Then he crossed the driveway to where one of McHenry's squad was dying. The man was on his back, twitching and moaning, trying to point a finger at Nicky Booth. Two of the black shirts grabbed Nicky and pulled her over to the Red Man, who knelt down next to the dying man and began carving one of the ears from his head. Screams echoed over the corn. Nicky tried to turn her head, but the soldiers wouldn't let her. "This was Ken Stoller's mighty rescue party," he said, holding up the bloody ear. Black blood dripped off the Red Man's fingers. "Nobody's coming for you, Nicky. You realize that now, don't you? Do the right thing, and tell me where I can find Don Fisher right now." Nicky said nothing. "No." The Red Man held up the ear he just cut off from the dying soldier's head. "You know that man, don't you? I bet you trained him yourself, didn't you? Well, Nicky, you have the power now to decide how he's gonna die." Then the Red Man turned and flung the man's ear between two zombies, who immediately fell on the morsel like snarling dogs in a pit. "He can die like that. Or you can tell me where I can find Don Fisher, and I'll have my soldiers shoot him in the head. It'll be over in one shot." Even from the hayloft, Richardson could see Nicky Booth steeling herself against the decision she was forced to make. She shook her head.
"You sadden me, Nicky," the red man said. "You truly do."
He let out another low, rattling moan, and the zombies who had been waiting at the edge of the corn moved forward like a wave and descended on the dying soldier, whose panicked whimpering had turned to screams once more. They ripped him open in seconds, pulling him apart, leaving nothing but a bloody puddle in the dirt. Richardson nearly threw up watching one of the zombies drag an arm across the driveway and into the ditch, where it started feeding.
"Roving camera,"
he thought.
"Roving camera. I'm a roving camera."
He repeated it in his head again and again, as though in the repetition of it he could force the images of the man's death out of his head. A moment later, the black shirts were stuffing Nicky Booth back in the truck, and the whole caravan was driving away, leaving a driveway full of bodies and zombies too wounded to climb into the trucks. Richardson fell back on his butt in shocked disbelief. Had life become so cheap that it could be tossed aside like that? He turned to look at Sylvia and Avery, but they were as horrified as he was. They sat that way for a long time, none of them speaking, until they heard a man's voice say,
"Dude, just stay down."
Richardson glanced at the women.
"Who is that?"
he whispered. Sylvia shrugged. Richardson leaned forward and peered through the slats. He saw a scraggly-looking younger man on the driveway. He was holding an AR-15, but it was obvious from his stance and the way he gripped the weapon that he didn't know how to use it. 10 yards ahead of him was a zombie, struggling to stand on the one leg he had left. The other was a burned and bleeding stump, severed just above the knee. Both the zombie's arms looked broken as well. Every time it tried to stand, it collapsed in a heap. It was breathing hard, and when at last it couldn't muster the strength to stand, it tried to pull itself along with its mangled fingers.
"Dude, come on,"
the scraggly-looking man said. He pointed the rifle at the zombie and pulled the trigger. It jumped in his hands as a 3-round burst left the gun, killing the zombie. Then he lowered the weapon and looked around. A dozen more zombies were pulling themselves along with their fingers, inching closer to him. "That's the man from the gas station," Richardson said.
"No," Sylvia said. "Impossible. He'd have changed by now."
"It is. Look at him." All 3 of them did. Then Sylvia sat back and shook her head.
"That's impossible. Ben, wait! Where are you going?"
Chapter 11. The morning had greeted Nate Royal with a kick in the ribs and something heavy dropping down on top of him. Nate groaned with the pain. He tried to roll over, but the body on top of him wouldn't budge.
"Get off,"
he said, pushing the body away. His arms felt limp as wet pasta. There was no strength in them, and even the slight effort of rolling over left him exhausted. With his head spinning and his stomach threatening to rise up his throat, he blinked at the man who had tripped over him, and was now rising to his feet.
"Oh, shit,"
Nate said. The man was a zombie. He was dressed in soiled rags, his face covered with abscesses and oozing sores. One ear was missing, and that side of his head and the shoulder beneath it was dark and crusty with dried blood. The zombie bared his teeth at Nate, and a stuttering moan escaped his lips. The moan was answered by other zombies all around them, just out of sight in the corn. Backing away from the zombie, Nate looked around. He couldn't see through the head-high cornstalks, but even through his fevered disorientation, he could sense movement all around him.
"Christ, not again!"
Nate tripped over a backpack on the ground, and for a moment couldn't place it. The fever still gripped him. His body felt achy and weak, his head in a fog. But he remembered walking by the river and finding the family that had taken care of him gone, their campsite cleaned of everything but the backpack at his feet. He remembered picking up the backpack and walking most of the day. The smoke and the smell of roasting meat had brought him to this place. He'd hoped that it was the family who had gone off and left him, but he hadn't been able to make it all the way. He got lost in this cornfield in the dark, and when he tripped and fell, he just stayed there, unable to get back up. But he had to move now. The zombie brought its hands up and started clutching for him. Its moans were becoming louder, more insistent, and other zombies were answering it. Nate looked over his shoulder and saw movement in the corn. The zombie put its hand on Nate's arm. He felt pressure from the thing's fingernails. "Get off!" he said, and yanked his arm away. The zombie stumbled forward and fell face first at Nate's feet. Nate backed away quickly. The zombie was on top of the backpack, and Nate reached down and pulled it out from under the zombie. And as the bag came away, a can of green beans fell into the dirt between them. The zombie was trying to get to its feet. Nate tossed the backpack aside and scooped up the can of beans, just as the zombie turned to face him. Gripping the can with both hands, he swung it down on the zombie's forehead. The edge of the can struck the thing's forehead and bounced off, and Nate, who with his fever could hardly keep his balance, went tumbling after it. He landed painfully, his hands bunched up underneath him. Nate heard a moan and rolled over. The zombie's head was haloed by morning sunlight, but Nate could still see the enormous gash across its forehead where the edge of the can had cut it. Fresh blood was streaming down the thing's face, getting in its eyes. It was reaching for him frantically, its moaning coming in a quick, animal-like snarl as its fingers tore at the stalks of corn all around it. Nate clambered away on his hands and knees. The zombie was right behind him, stepping on his feet, its fingers at the small of Nate's back. Nate gave the zombie a kick in the knee and rolled to one side, and when he did, he saw a stick about as long as his arm in the dirt. He picked it up and climbed to his feet. The zombie was turning toward him, its face covered with blood. Nate took the stick in both hands and stabbed the zombie in the face, catching it in the eye and causing it to fall to the ground, where it rolled over onto its side, twitching as if it had been electrocuted. Watching it, Nate let out a long sigh. He felt like he had to throw up, but as soon as he bent over, he saw more of the infected crashing through the corn, coming his way. "Damn it," he said. He didn't have the energy for this. There was a farmhouse behind him. He turned and staggered off in that direction. Nate was aware of noise, but his fever-addled mind couldn't pick it apart. He couldn't identify it. But he could hear the zombies moaning behind him. There was no confusion there. A bite from one of the zombies wouldn't hurt him. Not a small bite, anyway. But if they caught him, there would be no way in hell he'd be able to wrestle with them. 2 or 3 of them would be able to pull him apart, and his immunity couldn't help him with that. The noise was growing louder. He could hear men screaming. And was that gunfire he heard? It sounded sporadic, panicked. Something invisible whistled past his face. The next moment, the air seemed to come alive around his head. A high-pitched sizzle, like the sound of an angry swarm of bees, enveloped him. Stalks of corn and leaves were exploding, filling the air with floating bits of plant matter. "Bees?" he thought. "Oh, shit, bees!" Nate swatted at the air, trying to wave away the dark specks floating all around him. Between the noise and the fever and the floating bits whirling around him, he felt disoriented. He stumbled as he turned, trying to find the farmhouse, but suddenly unable to do so. Someone ran in front of him, a man in a gray shirt and black military-style pants. He was carrying a black rifle. Nate caught a flash of him before the darkness of the corn swallowed him up. "What the—" Nate turned around again, and this time he could see another man, dressed just like the first soldier who had sprinted by him, firing at a pair of zombies. Both zombies went down, but not before a third stepped out of the corn next to the man and tackled him to the ground. The zombie ripped out the man's throat, spattering blood all over the corn as the soldier's body twitched and convulsed under the attack. Nate could only stand there and stare at the ferocity of the attack. Thankfully, the man's screams were cut short by gunfire. He had wandered into a full-fledged battle, Nate realized. Looking around, he could see men in gray shirts and black pants fighting the zombies pouring out of the corn. Bullets continued to fly, but the soldiers had lost control of the situation. Even Nate could see that. The zombies had broken through their lines, and now the soldiers were on their own, firing at random into the corn, swinging their guns like clubs when their ammunition ran out, dropping to the ground beneath a hail of hands and teeth, their shrieks rising into the air, unheeded. Nate was nearing the edge of the corn. Beyond it, he could see a dirt driveway that led between the farmhouse and its barn. A few of the soldiers had managed to make it there already, but they were dying just like the others still stuck in the corn. One of the zombies moaned behind him, and Nate turned. It was the same zombie he'd gouged with the stick, and he could still see its blood and dirt-stained end protruding from the eye. A sickened groan escaped Nate's lips. "No," he said. "Dude, stay down." He was about to rush forward and push the zombie down, when one of the soldiers stumbled out of the corn next to him and opened fire. The bullets whizzed past Nate's head and thudded into the zombie with a stick in its eye. The zombie convulsed and fell to its knees. Nate, for his part, turned to watch the soldier run out of the corn and into the driveway, and right into the path of two big black trucks. The soldier turned his rifle onto the men in black pouring out of the trucks, but he wasn't fast enough. One of the men got off a burst of fire first and hit the soldier in the gut. The man collapsed into the dirt of the driveway and rolled over, groaning, unable to get back up. Nate recognized the men in the black shirts right away. They were the same men who had chased him from the gas station. Recognition went through him like an electrical surge. He backed up from the edge of the corn and knelt down. As he watched, he realized that the sounds of the fighting were gone. There was no more shooting, no more screaming. The only noise came from a warm breeze whistling quietly through the corn, and the faint murmur of groans from the wounded. "How did they find me?" Nate thought. "Jesus, it's me. They're here for me." "What do I do, Doc?" Nate said. "Come on, Doc, I need some help." Kellogg stepped through the corn, bits of floating leaves drifting through his form. He knelt down next to Nate, studying the events playing out in the driveway. "Looks like you got yourself into a mess," he said. "Just tell me what to do, Doc." "Stay down. Keep quiet. If they see you, run back into the corn." "I can't run, Doc. I'm hurting really bad." "Then keep your head down and hope they don't see you." A flash of red caught Nate's eye, and he looked up. The red man, the same one who had tried to infect Nate by sticking his finger in Nate's mouth, was getting out of the truck and walking over to the gut-shot soldier. "What in the hell?" "That right there," Kellogg said, "is trouble. Bad trouble." The red man looked down at the wounded man, then turned back to his truck, where two men in black were leading a pretty girl in handcuffs to the middle of the driveway. Despite his fear and his fever, Nate tilted his head to one side in appreciation. The girl had a nice shape, even in those military-style pants. One of the black shirts handed the red man a hunting knife. Without flourish or hesitation, the red man knelt down next to the wounded man and sliced his ear off.
"This was Ken Stoller's mighty rescue party,"
the red man said to the handcuffed girl. He showed her the ear, the blood dripping from his hand.
"Nobody is coming for you, Nicky. You realize that now, don't you? Do the right thing and tell me where I can find Don Fisher right now."
Don Fisher, Nate thought. Holy crap. Doc, what's going on? Quiet, Nate.
No,
The red man held up the ear he'd just cut off from the dying man's head. His eyes were locked on the pretty girl's face.
You know that man, don't you? I bet you trained him yourself, didn't you? Well, Nicky, you have the power now to decide how he's gonna die.
Then the red man tossed the ear to a couple of waiting zombies, who tore into it like they hadn't fed in days.
He can die like that,
the red man went on.
Or you can tell me where I can find Don Fisher, and I'll have my soldier shoot him in the head. It'll be over in one shot.
Nate had no idea what was going on, why the red man was trying to bargain with this girl. But he could tell the girl was tough. She clearly knew the dying man. The way she looked at him, it was obvious she had known him for a long time. But when she straightened her back and shook her head at the red man, there was no hesitation.
"That one's got some grit,"
Nate muttered. "Quiet, Nate," Kellogg said. "Just watch. Don't get involved. Whatever that is, it isn't your fight." The red man said something to her after that, but it was drowned out by the dying man's screams as the zombies swarmed over him. The next instant, the red man's soldiers were pushing the handcuffed girl back into the truck. Then the trucks lurched forward, gravel popping beneath their tires, and they were gone, leaving only a slowly settling cloud of white dust and the muffled groans of the dying.
"Doc, what just happened?"
No answer.
"Doc!"
But Kellogg was gone. Something rustled in the corn behind him, and Nate turned. It was the zombie with a stick in its eye, crawling now, its bloody hands almost close enough to tighten around his ankle.
"God damn it,"
Nate said.
"Dude!"
He walked crookedly out onto the driveway. The red man's trucks were a long way off, almost out of sight. Nate breathed a sigh of relief. Turning, Nate saw the bloody mess on the driveway where the gut-shot soldier had died. There was little left but a hand here and a foot with part of a leg still attached over there. But his rifle was still here. Nate walked over to the gun and picked it up. It felt light in his hands. He wasn't quite sure how to hold it, but he could see the selector switch on the side of the gun was set to burst, and he knew that meant it would fire a bunch of rounds at a time when he pulled the trigger. He sensed movement behind him. It was the zombie with the stick in its eye again. It had managed to crawl out of the corn and onto the driveway, its fingernails tearing off its fingertips as it pulled itself toward him.
"Dude, come on,"
Nate said. Nate was exhausted. His head was swimming from the fever, but he forced himself to focus. He leveled the rifle at the zombie and pulled the trigger. The bullets tore into its head and shoulders, and broke open its skull like an egg that was dropped on the floor, its blood and brains oozing into the dirt.
"Fucking right,"
Nate said, swaying on his feet.
"Now leave me the fuck alone."
Richardson had thrown himself over the side of the loft and was going down the ladder. Sylvia appeared above him and said,
"Ben, wait. What are you doing?"
"I'm going out there, Sylvia."
"You can't, Ben. Don't!"
He was at the bottom of the ladder, looking up at her. "Sylvia, this is important. That guy should have turned by now. He hasn't. We have to find out what's going on with him." She tried to argue, but Richardson didn't bother listening. He walked out of the barn and into the driveway. And there he stopped. He'd thought he had a good view of the fighting from the hayloft, and he had. He'd been able to see the big picture, the ebb and flow of the battle. He'd been the roving camera. But down here, on the ground, the view was something else, more visceral, more immediate. Being the camera was fine, but not like this. He saw body parts everywhere. Hands, a part of a leg, a shirt with just a hunk of shoulder left in it. A few zombies were still pulling themselves along as best they could toward the wounded soldiers who blinked at the morning sunlight and reached for Richardson with bloody, trembling fingers, groaning for help. A few zombies had already latched onto the dying men, their diseased faces tearing into the soft parts of the soldiers' necks with eager, slurping sounds.
"Ben, don't go out there!"
He looked over his shoulder. Sylvia was standing there, at the entrance to the barn. Her expression was desperate, terrified. "I'll be right back," he said. But when he walked to the middle of the driveway and got a close look at the man from the gas station, he thought that maybe he had made a bad mistake. The man's eyes shone with fever. It gave him an almost feral intensity. His face was flushed, covered in sweat and grime. There were twigs and leaves and bits of corn silk stuck in his long, shaggy hair and beard. He looked like a man who has reverted to a wild state. "You're not infected, are you?" Richardson said. The man raised the rifle and tried to point it at Richardson. But he was swaying badly, and he looked clumsy with the gun in his hands, like maybe it weighed too much for him. "I don't want to hurt you," Richardson said. The man just stared at him, like the simple act of standing up was almost too much for him. The barrel of the gun was pointed off at the barn. Every few seconds the scraggly man's swaying would cause it to drift back toward Richardson, and then it would just as quickly slip off again. Richardson figured he could probably bum-rush the guy and get the gun away before he had a chance to fire off a shot, but an instinct told Richardson that would be the wrong way to play it. "There are 2 women with me," Richardson said, "back over there at the barn. We saw what happened at the gas station yesterday, how the red man tried to infect you. Why haven't you turned yet?" At the mention of the red man, the barrel locked on Richardson and stayed there.
"Stay away,"
the scraggly man said. "Easy," Richardson answered. "I'm a friend."
"Bullshit. I ain't got no friends."
The gun barrel dipped to the ground. Richardson watched it sink, suddenly alarmed at how badly the other man was swaying. "He's going to fall over any second," Richardson thought.
"Doc, what do I do?"
Richardson looked around. A few zombies were slowly inching their way onto the road, pulling themselves along with ruined fingers at garden slug speed. Behind him, Sylvia and Avery were watching apprehensively. But there was no one else around. "Who are you talking to?" Richardson asked. "Who's Doc?" No answer. "Hey, can you hear me? Who's Doc?"
"Zombies can't hurt me," the man said. "Nobody can hurt me. Doc said so. I'm immune."
Richardson wasn't sure he'd heard him correctly. "You're what? Hey, can you hear me?" The man's head lolled on his shoulders, and his face blanched. The gun fell from his hand. Richardson rushed forward to grab the man before he too fell to the ground, but he didn't make it in time. The man hit the ground like a bag of rocks. Later that afternoon, Richardson was back in the driveway, this time with a wooden baseball bat in his hands. They had hoped most of the zombies wounded during the fighting that morning would die off within a few minutes. But that hadn't happened. More than a few had gone on moaning throughout the day, and those moans had attracted other zombies, who were not injured. One of those zombies had come crashing through the front door, and Richardson had been forced to put it down before it got a chance to take a bite out of Avery. After that, he'd gone outside with the bat to finish what they should have done as soon as the red man and his soldiers left.
"Ben."
It was Sylvia, calling to him from the front porch of the abandoned farmhouse. He looked away from the zombie skull he'd just turned into mush, and saw her waving at him.
"He's starting to come out of it a little," she said.
He nodded, then looked back to the dead zombie at his feet, and his continued existence suddenly seemed so pointless. The wandering, the stories, the fight to survive. Why was he bothering with it? Wasn't he just going to end up like this poor bastard? They all would in the end. And everything he'd done, all the interviews, all the thinking, all the friends he'd lost since the first zombie rose up from the flooded ruins of Houston 8 years ago, all of it would be for nothing. Just wasted effort.
Ben?
Coming, he said, and with a sigh he turned away from the dead zombie and trotted to the farmhouse porch. Sylvia was waiting there, leaning against a doorway that had no door.
"Are you okay?"
she asked. She nodded toward the driveway and the dead zombie he just pounded into a bloody puddle.
"Did something happen?"
"No," he said. He was aware of what she was asking, but he didn't feel like getting into it with her. Not now. "We're good, I think. I checked to the edge of the corn all the way around. I didn't see any movement." She took a long time to answer.
"Okay. Well, that man is starting to come around. He's still burning up, but I think the fever will break soon, especially once that Tamiflu kicks in."
She glanced at the sky, the air already turning hazy and golden beyond the farmhouse.
"Ben, I think we ought to head out as soon as we can. I'd like to be away from here before it starts getting dark."
Richardson stepped over to the doorway and glanced inside. Looters had taken most everything that wasn't nailed down. They'd left trash scattered in with the bits of the ceiling plaster that had fallen to the floor over the years. Avery had cleared away a clean area on the floor. The man was lying in the middle of that clear spot, groaning miserably, with Avery on her knees next to him. But his groaning was an improvement over the tossing and turning and constant fevered babbling he'd been doing most of the day. "And what about him?" Richardson asked.
"What about him?"
"You're not seriously suggesting we leave him here, are you?"
What would you have us do with him, Ben? We need to go. Avery and we have to get to Herculaneum and charter a boat to Chester. We don't have time for strays."
"But he's important, Sylvia. You've heard him calling out for Doc. He's got all that Tamiflu and those antibiotics. He got those from somewhere, from somebody who knew what they were doing."
Well, why didn't those people take care of him?
"I don't know."
"But you think we should take care of him? Ben, how are we going to do that? We can't even defend ourselves. And somehow we have to find a way to rescue Nicky."
"If we leave him here, he'll die."
"You don't know that. He's survived since the outbreak. Obviously he can take care of himself."
He grunted, shook his head. "You were the one who tried to tell me that the infected were worth all this effort to save."
"Well, he's not infected. He's a human being, a living, disease-free human being. Shouldn't he be more important than those zombies out there?" "You're being overly dramatic, Ben."
"And you're being a cold-hearted bitch." She chewed on her lip while she considered him.
"I'd slap your mouth if I thought you meant that,"
she said.
"Let it go," he thought. "Make a bubble. Count to 10.
"Look," he said, "that guy is immune to the necrosis filovirus.
That means something huge. In all the wandering I've done, I've never met anybody like that.
Hell, I've never met anybody who even thought that was possible.
And then I meet you and Avery, and you guys tell me you're looking for somebody who's immune. Well, there he is, Sylvia. He's right there. All we have to do is take him with us."
"All you've got is his word that he's immune," she said.
"And the fact that he's right there. Sylvia, you saw the red man try to turn him into a zombie. He should have changed by now, but he hasn't. Can you think of any other way to explain that?"
Richardson stopped there, waiting for her to reply. But when she didn't, he threw up his hands in exasperation.
"Unbelievable," he said. "You're as obstinate and bull-headed as you ever were."
He shook his head, turned, and went inside.
"What are you doing?"
she said to his back. "What does it look like? I'm going to talk to him."
"You can't talk to him. You heard him raving in there. He's out of his head."
Yeah, Richardson thought. He'd heard him raving. He'd heard him talking to Doc, whoever that was. He'd heard him talking to himself, saying not to ever tell anybody anything unless you know more about them than they do about you. "I've got an idea," Richardson said. Avery rose from the scraggly man's side and gave Richardson a wide berth as she made her way back to Sylvia. Richardson, meanwhile, knelt by the man's side and shook him gently. "Hey, can you hear me?" The man's eyes fluttered open. He took a look at Richardson, and then he crab-crawled away from him. "Easy, easy," Richardson said. "I don't want to hurt you. My name's Ben Richardson. That's Sylvia Carnes over there, and Avery Hopper there." The man's eyes went from Richardson to the women, and then back to Richardson. But he said nothing. "What's your name?" The man seemed to consider it. Then, with effort, he said,
"Nate."
His voice was soft, barely a whisper. Avery had been giving him water from a plastic bottle, and there were little bubbles of water trapped in his beard. "Nate," Richardson said. "Okay. It's good to meet you, Nate." Richardson sat down on the floor, grimacing at the stiffness in his joints. "It sucks getting old, Nate," he said, laughing. Nate's expression didn't change. "You've been feeling sick lately, haven't you?" Richardson said. "I saw that Tamiflu in your backpack, and those antibiotics. And you were talking to somebody named Doc while you were sleeping." Richardson was watching Nate carefully, expecting him to glance over at his backpack. When you lived on the road, as Nate surely did, you guarded your stuff like your life depended on it, because it did. But to Richardson's surprise, Nate never even glanced at it. Instead, he reached to his chest and clutched something under his shirt, like he was checking to make sure it was still there. "You don't talk much, do you?"
"No,"
Nate said. "Well, that's okay. Sometimes it's best not to say anything until you know a little bit about who you're talking to. You know what I'm saying?"
"Yeah."
"Yeah, of course you do. So I'll make it easy for you. You know my name, Ben Richardson. Before the outbreak, I was a staff writer for The Atlantic. That was a magazine. Ever heard of it?"
"I'm not much of a reader,"
Nate said. "Ah," Richardson said. "Well, that's okay. It was a magazine, and I was a reporter. My job was to write a book about the zombie outbreak. As part of my research, I went into San Antonio with Sylvia Carnes there. That's her there." Sylvia raised her hand and smiled. "San Antonio didn't work out so well. After that, I went to Houston to interview members of the Quarantine Authority. I was in a helicopter that crashed into the ruins of Houston. I met a couple of survivors, and together we slogged our way to the wall. We didn't know it, but we were right in the middle of the second wave of the outbreak. We got to the wall right as it was coming down." Richardson studied Nate's face for some sort of reaction, but there was none. "Well," he said, pushing on, "after we reached the wall, we just decided to keep going. I mean, we couldn't stay there, you know. So we wandered north until we saw signs for a community this preacher named Jasper Sewell was forming."
"The Cedar River grasslands."
The words stopped Richardson cold. "That's right," he said. "You heard what happened at the grasslands?" Nate didn't answer right away. He looked around the bare, dilapidated farmhouse. He wouldn't meet their eyes. Finally, he said,
"I was there."
"You were there?" Richardson said. "At the grasslands?" Nate nodded. Look," Richardson said. "It was kind of a small community, and I was there for about 3 months. I got to know pretty much everybody. I don't remember you."
"I was there,"
Nate said. A slow struggle seemed to be going on behind his scraggly beard and dirty face, like he was arguing with himself about how much to say. But at last he said,
"I was at Minot Air Force Base. The doctors there were working on me because I'm immune to the disease that makes people into zombies."
He ducked his head slightly and reached under the collar of his shirt and pulled out a flash drive hanging from a lanyard around his neck.
They were using me as a guinea pig to find a cure. There was a doctor there named Mark Kellogg. He managed to find the cure, and he put it on this right before the base was overrun. They all died. All of them except for a few of the officers. They put me on a helicopter and flew me to the grasslands, hoping to keep me safe.
"Oh, my God," Richardson said. "Now I remember you." His past was rushing up to meet him, and it was coming faster than he could process. First Sylvia Carnes, and then this guy, another survivor of the grasslands. He didn't know what to say, but Sylvia didn't give him a chance to say anything. She knelt down beside him and said,
"Nate, you said there was a cure. You have it? You have the cure there?"
Nate made a fist over the flash drive.
"This doctor," she said,
her voice almost trembling with excitement.
"Is he the one who gave you the Tamiflu and the antibiotics?"
Nate shook his head.
"No. Some guy gave me those."
"Who?" Sylvia said.
"I forget. Some guy. I met him down by the river. He was camping there with his family."
"What was his name, Nate? Did he tell you his name?"
"Yeah, something Fisher. Weird dude. Looked like he was crippled or something. His legs didn't work. He had to pull himself around like a snake, you know. He was kind of creepy."
Sylvia made a sound that was part laugh and part disbelief.
"Don Fisher," she said. "Was that his name? Don Fisher?"
"Yeah, I think so,"
Nate said.
"Sounds right."
"Did you tell him about the cure? You told him that you were immune?"
No,"
Nate said. "You didn't? Nate, please tell me you're kidding. You met the man who could have interpreted that flash drive, who could have produced a cure, and you didn't say anything?"
Nate didn't speak, which Richardson figured was probably for the best. For the next moment, Sylvia grabbed two big handfuls of her own hair in fists clenched so tightly the knuckles cracked. Her body was shaking with anger. Then she stood up and stormed out the front door, giving the wall a good solid kick as she left.
"I'm sorry,"
Nate said, turning to Richardson.
"I didn't know. Doc Kellogg, he told me to never tell anybody about the cure unless I was sure they were on my side. And after the grasslands, everything's been so confusing."
"It's okay, Nate," Richardson said. "It's nothing we can't fix. I hope." Chapter 12. 2 days later, after Nate was well enough to travel, they entered the outskirts of Herculaneum. It was late morning and already hot. There wasn't much of a breeze, just the muddy, earthy smell of the river nearby, and the sun was beating down on the back of Richardson's neck. He felt like he was being punished. Richardson and Sylvia were out in front, while Nate Royal and Avery Harper followed about 20 steps behind. Richardson, breathing hard, wiped the sweat from his face with a rag, and then folded the rag into a small square and stuffed it back into the pocket of his jeans. He was carrying his own pack, plus all the rifles they'd collected from the dead soldiers at the farmhouse battle, and the weight was starting to drag him down. "You mind if we stop for a sec?" he said. Sylvia looked at him. She was frowning with frustration. Richardson was certain he saw fear there as well. With good reason, too. The night before, she told him it had been years since she'd been this far from the compound, so this was all new to her. And the carefully constructed plan Nicky Booth had set up for them was falling apart. For the first time in a long time, Sylvia Carnes was working without a safety net. It probably didn't help matters that he'd been with her the last time she did that, back in San Antonio. Sylvia looked over her shoulder at Avery and said,
"How much farther?"
They were standing in the middle of a long, straight street, ruined buildings on either side of them. Most of the wooden telephone poles that ran the length of the street were still standing, but here and there a few had fallen and were blocking the street. Weeds and spindly shrubs grew out of cracks in the sidewalk and along the base of the buildings. In the distance, they could see the shadowy outline of a big industrial wreck, the remnants of a lead smelting plant. Avery Harper pointed at the smelting plant and said,
"We're almost there. We just keep going toward that. The free trading market is just around the right side of it."
"Okay," Sylvia said, irritably. "I guess we can rest for a second, but just for a moment." She stood the hair off her shoulders and then pulled it back into a tight ponytail. Richardson watched her as she tied it off with her black ribbon, wondering why she bothered. The way her hair frizzed up on her, she'd be retying it before they made 10 blocks. He tried to remember her the way she'd been back in San Antonio. A little heavier, maybe, softer looking, her hair still black. The years since then had made her lean and given her face an almost bird-like angularity. A funny thought occurred to him. At times, she looked an awful lot like the lawyers in the pen and ink drawings in the Charles Dickens books he'd had in his apartment before the outbreak. He smiled inwardly at the thought. She would be offended by the comparison, even though he didn't intend it that way. Far from it. She was actually quite pretty, knobby elbows and hooked nose and frizzy gray hair notwithstanding.
"What are you looking at?"
she said, not even trying to disguise the petulance in her voice. "I was trying to remember if you wore glasses."
"What?"
"Did you? Wear glasses, I mean? I've been thinking back to San Antonio, and I can't remember if you wore glasses back then."
"No."
"You didn't? I could have sworn you did."
"I said no. Besides, you just said you couldn't remember."
"I was just asking."
"No, you weren't. You weren't making any sense. First you say you've been trying to remember, but you can't. The next minute you're swearing that I did. You don't make any sense, Ben."
He didn't know what to make of that. "I was just asking," he said. She let out a frustrated sigh and rolled her eyes. She was carrying their water, and she slid off her pack and took out a bottle of water and drank from it.
"You want some?"
she asked. He took the water and drank from the bottle and handed it back to her. "Thanks." She handed the bottle to Avery. Sylvia scanned the buildings and the side streets for signs of movement. They had already seen a few turkey farmers driving their flocks to market, and vegetable dealers with their carts, and several people hauling wheelbarrows full of pecans and walnuts, and the increased activity had them all on edge. "Just out of curiosity," he said, "what did you guys do for people who needed glasses? Did you have an optometrist in the compound or something?"
"What?"
"It must have come up, right? I mean, Ken Stoller wears glasses. I remember that from Eddie Hudson's book. I'm sure you had other people there who wore glasses, right? Prescriptions change over time. Glasses break, get scratched. People need new ones all the time. How'd you guys handle that?" She stared at him, her mouth agape.
"What are you asking me for? I told you I don't wear glasses. How the hell should I know what people do to get new glasses?"
He adjusted the packs on his shoulders. "I was just asking."
"Jesus, Ben, drop it, would you? You always do that. You don't know when to leave well enough alone. You just keep picking at me."
"Me?" he said. "I can't leave well enough alone?" He knew the argument wasn't going anywhere, and by speaking all he was doing was fueling her fire. But he couldn't help himself. He said, "Hello? Pot, you're black."
"I'm what?"
"It's an expression," he said. "The kettle calling—"
"I know the expression, but you've got it backward, you moron. It's the pot calling the kettle black. The hypocrisy is on the pot's side, not the kettle's. You're calling me the pot while you're ignorant of your own hypocrisy."
"Hypocrisy? Sylvia, Jesus, I was just asking you what you guys did for glasses." She threw up her hands and made an angry huff.
Idiot,
she muttered. Then she turned away and stormed off. He watched her go. He'd made her mad, and he didn't understand how the whole thing had gotten so out of control. It was just an honest question, and a not very important one in the great scheme of things. He should have just let it go. But it wasn't all his fault, he reminded himself. She'd been like this since the battle at the farmhouse, since meeting Nate and hearing that he could have saved them all a whole lot of trouble if he'd simply introduced himself to Don Fisher. It wasn't hard to figure out she was disgusted by that missed opportunity. He was, too, but that didn't account for her being angry with him. Or maybe it did. Hell, he didn't know. It had been 6 years since he'd spent any time at all with a woman. More than 20 since he'd lived with one. Most of what he remembered of women was like trying to picture a diamond through a pawnbroker's grimy yellow display case. But now that he thought about it, he did remember that they saw the world differently from men. They weren't pragmatists. Yes, they had reason, but it wasn't the same kind of reason that men had. When they thought about a problem, they didn't think in a straight line, from problem to solution. Their way of thinking made countless loops and diversions on its way to a conclusion. They seemed to thrive on subtext and implied meaning, the kind of things that men just didn't have the time or patience for. Richardson found the whole thing really aggravating.
Are you two married?
Huh? It was Nate Royal talking to him. Avery had paused for a second, then hurried on after Sylvia, leaving Richardson and Nate standing there.
You sure act like you're married.
We're not married, Richardson said. He adjusted the packs on his back and started walking after the woman.
Is she still angry with me?
Nate asked. His expression was wide-eyed and innocent. Yeah, I think so, Richardson said.
Oh.
Nate walked on sullenly beside him for a few moments before adding,
So, why is she taking it out on you?
Richardson stopped and looked at him. Nate's fever had broken that first night after the battle at the farmhouse, and the next morning Richardson had gotten a pair of scissors and a razor and some soap, and helped Nate get himself clean. They'd shaved his beard and his head, and now all that remained of the shaggy mess that had once hidden his face was a light brown shadow of stubble on his cheeks and the top of his head. He had looked like a refugee from an Iron Maiden concert. Now he reminded Richardson of the wraith-like extras Hollywood movies used to show in Victorian-era mental hospitals. But he didn't look so bad that Avery Harper hadn't taken an interest in him. Shortly after his big cleanup, Nate and Avery had actually hit it off quite well. So much so that when Richardson and Sylvia had returned from gathering water and walked into the farmhouse's entranceway, they'd seen Nate on his back on the floor, Avery sitting next to him, his hand on her leg while she laughed at something he was telling her.
I don't like that,
Sylvia had said. They're just kids, Richardson had responded.
I don't like it,
she said. Sylvia, you taught college. You know how this goes. Kids will be kids. You can't keep them apart. Sylvia had let out a noise somewhere between a groan and a growl, and with that one gesture she'd made it clear what she thought of Nate and Avery hooking up. And he'd said a silent prayer for Nate.
Mr. Richardson?
Huh?
I said, why is she taking it out on you?
Richardson laughed to himself. You ever been married, Nate? Lived with a woman, maybe?
No. I lived with my dad and his girlfriend before the outbreak. Since then, I haven't had too much time with a woman, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, well, I knew Sylvia years back. There's a history there.
You guys...
Nate made a lewd, two-handed pushing gesture, accompanied by a clicking of his tongue.
You know?
No. Not that it's any of your business. Nate raised an eyebrow, then shrugged good-naturedly and let it drop. A few minutes later, they reached a slight rise at the